Western History from an Egyptian Perspective. This course teaches the 5,000-year history of Western culture from the perspective of ancient Egypt. It aims to introduce students to the philosophical and literary legacy of Egypt in terms of the Sebayat and the prophetic literature. It then will focus on the way this literature was received and translated by the Greeks in the Alexandrian period. Finally, it reframes an understanding of Western culture around the transmission of the Hermetica, exploring the afterlife of Egyptian antiquity within Western culture in the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and up to the present day. This video presents the syllabus that will underlie the lectures in this series. If you read some or all of these books, you will have a good enough understanding of the subject to carry out your own research in this field. Moses the Egyptian. To account for the complexities of the foundational event through which monotheism was established, Moses the Egyptian goes back to the short-lived monotheistic revolution of the Egyptian king Akhenaten. Asman traces the monotheism of Moses to this source, then shows how his followers denied the Egyptians any part in the origin of their beliefs and condemned them as polytheistic idolaters. Thus began the cycle in which every counter-religion, by establishing itself as truth, denounced all others as false. Asman reconstructs this cycle as a pattern of historical abuse and tracks its permutations from ancient sources, including the Bible, through Renaissance debates over the basis of religion to Sigmund Freud's Moses and monotheism. One of the great Egyptologists of our time and an exceptional scholar of history and literature, Asman is uniquely equipped for this undertaking, an exemplary case study of the vicissitudes of historical memory that is also a compelling lesson in the fluidity of cultural identity and beliefs. The Mind of Egypt. The Mind of Egypt presents an unprecedented account of the mainsprings of Egyptian civilization, the ideals, values, mentalities, belief systems, and aspirations that shaped the first territorial state in human history. Drawing on a range of literary, iconographic, and archaeological sources, renowned historian Jan Asman reconstructs a world of unparalleled complexity, a culture that, long before others, possessed an extraordinary degree of awareness and self-reflection. Moving through successive periods of Egyptian civilization, from its beginnings in the 5th millennium BC until the rise of Christianity 4,500 years later, Asman traces the cultural roles of the pharaohs, the priests, and the imperial bureaucracy. He explores the ideal relation of man to God and explains monumental architecture and ritual celebrations as expressions of that ideal. Most strikingly, he focuses on the meaningful world of ancient Egypt, the multiple notions of time, the structures of immortality, and the commitment to the principle of social justice and human fellowship. Religio Duplex. In this important book, the Egyptologist Jan Asman provides a masterful overview of a crucial theme in the religious history of the West, that of Religio Duplex, or dual religion. He begins by returning to the theology of the ancient Egyptians, who set out to present their culture as divided between the popular and the elite. By examining their beliefs, he argues, we can distinguish the two faces of ancient religions more generally: the outer face, that of the official religion, and the inner face, encompassing the mysterious nature of religious experience. Osman explains that the early modern period witnessed the birth of the idea of dual religion, with, on the one hand, the religion of reason, and on the other, that of revelation. This concept gained new significance in the Enlightenment when the dual structure of religion was transposed onto the individual. This meant that man now owed his allegiance not only to his native religion, but also to a universal religion of mankind. More than any other, this volume in this series relates the religion of ancient Egypt to the beliefs and practices of Western culture in the early modern period. Black Athena, Volume 1. In one of the most audacious works of scholarship ever written, Martin Bernal challenges the foundation of our thinking about this question. Classical civilization, he argues, has deep roots in Afro-Asiatic cultures. But these Afro-Asiatic influences have been systematically ignored, denied, or suppressed since the 18th century, chiefly for racist reasons. The popular view is that Greek civilization was the result of the conquest of a sophisticated but weak native population by vigorous Indo-European speakers, Aryans from the north. But the classical Greeks, Bernal argues, knew nothing of this Aryan model. They did not see their institutions as original, but as derived from the East, and from Egypt in particular. This book caused a controversy and a firestorm when it was first released, but of all the books in this series, it argues most for the particularly African origin of Western civilization. The Hieroglyphics of Horapollo. Written reputedly by an Egyptian magus, Horapollo Niliacus, in the 4th century AD, the Hieroglyphics of Horapollo is an anthology of nearly 200 hieroglyphics, or allegorical emblems, said to have been used by the pharaonic scribes in describing natural and moral aspects of the world. Translated into Greek in 1505, it informed much of Western iconography from the 16th through the 19th centuries. This work not only tells how various types of natural phenomena, emotions, virtues, philosophical concepts, and human character types were symbolized, but also explains why, for example, the universe is represented by a serpent swallowing its tail, filial affection by a stork, education by the heavens dropping dew, and a horoscopist by a person eating an hourglass. In his introduction, Boas explores the influence of the hieroglyphics and the causes behind the rebirth of interest in symbolism in the 16th century. The illustrations to this edition were drawn by Albrecht Dürer on the verso pages of his copy of a Latin translation. The Myth of Egypt and its Hieroglyphs. Eric Iverson describes the powerful effect of the myth of Egypt, particularly Egyptian hieroglyphs, on European literature, art, religion, and philosophy. This is the story of a creative misunderstanding. An erroneous interpretation of the traditions of ancient Egypt became a rich source of inspiration for Europeans from ancient times through the medieval and Renaissance periods to the Baroque era. The misguided notion that hieroglyphs were allegorical and that they constituted a sacred writing of ideas exerted a dynamic influence in almost all fields of intellectual and artistic endeavor, as did conceptions of Egypt as the venerable home of true wisdom and of occult and mystic knowledge. The Baroque Piazza Navona in Rome, for instance, is only one of the many great public spaces that center on an Egyptian obelisk and attempt to read its mysterious signs. Iverson begins by discussing the nature of Egyptian writing. Then he explains, in detail and with apposite illustrations and quotations, the way in which Europeans tried to understand and use the hieroglyphs. A final chapter sets Jean-François Champollion's decipherment of the hieroglyphs into a vividly reconstructed historical context. This book provides one of the best ways to understanding the Hieroglyphica of Horapollo from Boas' volume before. Hermetica. The Hermetica are a body of mystical texts written in late antiquity, but believed during the Renaissance, when they became well known, to be much older. Their supposed author, a mythical figure named Hermes Trismegistus, was thought to be a contemporary of Moses. The Hermetic philosophy was regarded as an ancient theology, parallel to the revealed wisdom of the Bible, supporting biblical revelation and culminating in the Platonic philosophical tradition. This new translation is the only English version based on reliable texts, and Professor Copenhaver's introduction and notes make this accessible and up-to-date edition an indispensable resource to scholars. The Egyptian Hermes. Sage, scientist, and sorcerer, Hermes Trismegistus was the culture hero of Hellenistic and Roman Egypt. A human, according to some, who had lived about the time of Moses, but now indisputably a god. He was credited with the authorship of numerous books on magic and the supernatural, alchemy, astrology, theology, and philosophy. Until the early 17th century, few doubted the attribution. Even when unmasked, Hermes remained a byword for the arcane. Historians of ancient philosophy have puzzled much over the origins of his mystical teachings, but this is the first investigation of the Hermetic milieu by a social historian. Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. Placing Bruno, both advanced philosopher and magician burned at the stake, in the Hermetic tradition, Yeats's acclaimed study gives an overview not only of Renaissance humanism, but of its interplay and conflict with magic and occult practices. This book is a product of its time, emerging in the landscape of the 1960s and the romantic nostalgia for the lost spiritual traditions of Europe. Nevertheless, it remains a good introduction to the reception of Hermetic texts within the Renaissance, and is required reading for anyone seeking to understand Egyptian survivals in Western culture. The secret lore of Egypt. Alchemy, astrology, and other secret sciences have Egyptian roots, and films, popular fiction, and comic books frequently draw upon Egyptian themes. Rosicrucianism, Mormonism, and Afrocentrism all share Egyptian-derived elements. Modern-day esoteric endeavors find an endlessly renewable intellectual reservoir in ancient Egyptian culture, Eric Hornum believes, and are almost inconceivable without Egypt. Although such persistence assures Egyptosophical ideas are an extraordinary widespread impact, the field of Egyptology has largely overlooked this phenomenon. Although such persistence assures Egyptosophical ideas an extraordinarily widespread impact, the field of Egyptology has largely overlooked this phenomenon. In The Secret Lore of Egypt, Hornung traces the influence of the esoteric image of Egypt, especially as it is manifested by the god Thoth, on European intellectual history since antiquity, and finds it reasserted even today in the United States. From Gnostic writings and Romantic poetry to Freemasonry and the Theosophist movement, Egyptian deities re-emerge in ever-surprising guises. Since ancient times, Egypt has been associated with esoteric practices and beliefs, and regarded as the source of all secret knowledge, an association that, Hornum says, is only loosely connected with historical reality. There are also a number of journals dedicated to studying the survival of Egyptian religion within Western culture. Exploring articles published in these journals can be a good way to study the afterlife of Egyptian antiquity as well. The Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institute. The journal is intended as an interdisciplinary forum, uniting scholars specializing in cultural history, including the history of art, and intellectual history, including the history of ideas. It publishes articles based on new research, normally from primary sources. The subject matter encompasses intellectual themes and traditions, the arts in their various forms, religion, philosophy, science, literature, and magic, as well as political and social life from antiquity to the dawn of the contemporary era. Typically, the subjects discussed either center on or have some connection with Western, usually European cultures. Therefore, too, the journal provides a home for research into the many interconnections between those cultures and others which have flourished beyond European borders, particularly, but by no means limited to, the cultures and learning of the Near East, meaning Egypt and Babylon. Founded in 1937 as one of the first publishing projects of the Warburg Institute following its arrival in London, the Journal of the Warburg Institute became the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes 2 years later, and has flourished as a collaborative enterprise since that time. Still produced in-house at the Warburg, the journal relies on editorial and advisory board members drawn from both the Warburg Institute and the Courtauld Institute of Art, and on our two institutions' extensive scholarly libraries, research facilities, and international links and networks. Aegyptiaca, Journal of the History of the Reception of Ancient Egypt. Aegyptiaca is an international open-access journal published by the Department of Egyptology, University of Heidelberg. It is dedicated to the documentation and research of the history of reception of ancient Egypt. The journal will be published biannually in English language and will accept German and French articles as well. The journal tries to encourage a coherent discussion on the concept and agency of Egypt in the West. As this topic is an object of research in many different disciplines, the journal tries to cover a wide range of fields and all periods of the history of reception of ancient Egypt, and it is open to different approaches and methods. By doing this, the journal tries to keep in mind the question if and in which regard the confrontation with Egypt was a relevant factor of cultural history. The journal will publish articles focusing on special aspects of the history of reception of ancient Egypt in the different testimonia, may it be texts, art, or objects, and intends to understand the detailed aspects as part of a bigger story at the same time. Some people learn more by reading fiction than by reading scholarly texts. As a fun extra credit option, here is a series of novels that dramatize the scholarly themes other books in this syllabus discuss in a literary form. Aegypt Tetralogy. Re-engaging the ideas of alternate lives, worlds, and worldviews that pulsed through his remarkable Little Big, John Crowley's Aegypt series is a landmark in contemporary fiction. The series helped earn Crowley the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award for Literature, and Harold Bloom installed the first two books in the series in his 1993 Western canon. In The Solitudes, the opening of the series, we are introduced to Pierce Moffat, an unorthodox historian and an expert in ancient astrology, myths, and superstition. The land that Moffat studies is not the real geographical Egypt, but Aegypt, the country of the imagination. When Moffat discovers the historical novels of local writer Fellows Craft, his course is charted. Craft's books interweave stories of Italian heretic Giordano Bruno, young Will Shakespeare, and Elizabethan occultist John Dee stories that begin to mingle with the narrative of Moffat's real and dream life in 1970s America. As Moffat's journey in and out of his comfortable reality continues, what becomes clear is revelatory. There is more than one history of the world. I hope you found this syllabus enlightening and that it will stimulate further research if you're interested in the incredibly obscure field of the survival of Egyptian culture within Western culture. It is obscure. It should not be obscure because once you start studying this, you begin to see all of the areas in our culture in which this has had an impact and how little it is spoken of. But in any case, if you're interested, there will be more lectures in this series. Subscribe, watch more, find out, learn some things if you like it. Hope you enjoyed.